Welcome Internet to a psychoanalytic talk, and today I want to talk about two very interesting concepts that often might overlap but are very different in a lot of areas. So those two concepts, as the title indicates, are projection and projective identification. So I'm going to mainly use it in terms of definitions, the language of psychoanalysis, right? And the Aggression in Personality Disorders, Chapter 10, Projection and Projective Identification, Developmental and Clinical Aspects by Otto Kernberg, which is really a great chapter and you should really go and read it. But I'm going to try and paraphrase, explain, and add my own ideas to the mix. So, very, very simply, we're going to start with projection, as I think it's the easiest one to understand. So, projection in psychoanalysis, and I think in daily life, like it's really become, I think, something that's often told like that and even spoken about, is the fact that if someone does not like something in themselves, they might project it onto someone else, meaning that some undesirable feeling, emotion, affect, desire, wish is going to be so intolerable in the self that the only mechanism to try and avoid the displeasure is going to be to throw it out far, far away or on someone else. Of course, it's not just other people. It can be an ideology, it can be an institution, it can be a concept. Projection is very wide, and sometimes very wild also. And what you have to remember is that projection is a standard defense mechanism, meaning that everyone can more or less project. It's not like a hard line defense mechanism, and often Kernberg talks in his book about how projection in itself is mainly neurotic. So just a quick recap: neurotics and neuroticism in psychoanalysis is not necessarily as bad as what it might seem. It's the idea that people, how can I say this in an interesting way? It's the idea that people basically have a suffering because they have an internal conflict that they cannot resolve. That internal conflict then creates symptoms that are important and might have massive repercussions on the daily life of the individual, but the individual never loses touch with reality or never becomes fully destructive of themselves or relationships. So that's really a big outline of it, but it's in a way people are divided, and that projection helps that division to be sustainable, because a person, instead of confronting the conflict and having something that's going to create mass anxiety, they're going to throw it out on someone else, but the anxiety is still going to come back, right? I.e., for example, Otto Kernberg gives those examples of patients which, quote unquote, were afraid that he would seduce them, but that in those cases, it's not that Kernberg was going to seduce them, but it's the patients that were afraid of it. They were projecting their own sexual desire onto the therapist. And basically he says that in those moments of projection, what is important and what's very interesting is that the analyst is not going to necessarily feel that it corresponds to him. Like, he's going to be able to tell the difference between his own way of dealing with things, his own perception, and what is thrown upon him, as if he was a blank canvas in a way. So that's the very first point of projection, is that it's something we reject, but it's something that others can kind of see and kind of analyze quickly, and it doesn't create an internal confusion. Like, you can feel that someone is projecting onto you, but that you still can maintain a good boundary between their projection and your identity, both as a therapist and even in daily life, because as I said, projection is really like a daily life issue, kind of, and that's something you have to keep in mind. It's not pathological per se, right? Everyone does it, and it's basically part of human nature, and it's completely acceptable at a minute, how can I say, at a minimal level. So this is for projection. It starts with Freud because Freud was he's the one who really gave it that psychodynamic influence. But for Freud, it was basically all encompassing, whereas now we would basically make divisions. And one of the main divisions is projective identification. So it's not a Freudian concept at all, projective identification. He never talked about it, even though he lumped it into projection, but there is a real fundamental difference, and I think that it's important. So basically, projective identification starts with Melanie Klein, and for her, so there is that projective aspect, like we talked about, how someone does not like what they are, what they feel, what they believe, and they throw it onto someone else in order to not be able to, or to be able to not cope with it, or to avoid it completely. But in the case of projective identification, it goes a step further. So it's what we call a primitive defense. A primitive is an early, meaning it's in the development of the individual. It's used at a much earlier stage than projection. Projection might happen so when a child is there, he might project. You might see him project. For example, the bad of the story, right? He's always going to be evil, wrong, and bad, right? So it's a projection of what the child does not want to see in himself. There's own tendencies to be bad, evil, or awful, and it's okay. But projective identification is the step under. So it happens normally with very, very young infants that can't deal with any of the internal conflict. They're not even really divided per se, so they kind of are in a massive turmoil. It's not a division. It's not a division of the self as it would be in projection. It's really something wholly different. And so for Klein, that internal turmoil can only be solved by projecting, but not just projecting, but by using identification, meaning throwing a bit of oneself into someone else, transforming that other in order for him to act and then react to the infant. And the fear of the infant is by using that projective identification, the person that's at the receiving end of the projective identification might start to want to destroy them, as he has been modified by the self of the infant. So that's a developmental consideration, meaning the growing up of an infant. But in clinical cases, we rarely have very, very, very young children. What we do have, though, is patients that use it. So for Kernberg, and that's something I fully agree on, and I'm fully on board with the idea, is that basically projective identification is when a patient sends something inside of the therapist and it starts conflicting with our own agency, with our own representations. And instead of like seeing the clear difference in between what the patient thinks of us and what we truly are, there starts to be some kind of merger, that we feel that something is not right. And in certain cases, we might even act like what the patient feels or thinks of us. And that action, that's not normally what we would do in another situation, we do it at that point, is the result of the projective identifications, because we have been in a way transformed, modulated by the projective identification of the patient that has forced us to act upon that identification because it was so strong. And that's another thing. The projective identification is much more massive in terms of psychic energy than projection, meaning that it's not just you can see it, it really like forces itself upon the therapist or upon the person. And that's a very important difference, that it's not a simple someone seeing something in you that's not there. It's someone putting the bit of themselves they hate in you for you to be able to act out a scenario. And basically that's a very, very interesting and important division, and it's clinically super important to remain with that notion, because with projective identification, the earlier you can kind of analyze it, the less impact it's going to have both in a therapeutic relationship and for the patient. Because the patient, through that, because it's not doing that through spite, it's a completely unconscious process. The idea for the patient is for the therapist, by the projective identification, for the therapist to be able to break the mold of repetition and do something else. In a way, transform the projective identification into something that's there and fixes what is projected rather than acting it out. So that's a very important distinction, that basically the projective identification is an unconscious mechanism that's there because the patient fundamentally needs someone to detoxify that bad element that he's feeling. And that's the whole point of the therapist. He's going to take on that projective identification and in the best case scenario be able to understand it, digest it, and reformulate it to the patient in order to both reassure the unconscious of the patient, not just the conscious mind, but the unconscious, and also strengthen the relationship that the analyst wasn't destroyed, broken down, or mutilated by the projective identification. He was strong enough to survive it and to build on it. And that is one of the most interesting and fundamental concepts, which I find very interesting and very important when you're going to work with people who have personality disorders or even psychosis, that sometimes some things just, how can I say, enter you, into your mind, into your framework, into your thinking, that is unusual or something that's completely alien. And the concept of projective identification gives a word, gives an understanding, and gives a guidance in order to try and process it, both for our minds and for the patients, and also for what Ogden calls the analytic third, meaning the relationship between us and the patient itself, which is a very important aspect. And through projective identification, there's real risk of the relationship being broken or destroyed. And that's why psychoanalysis is such an interesting and thorough discipline, because basically those sins that we often just exude or act upon need an understanding and need a place of belonging. And that's the big difference between projective identification and just projection. Projection is much milder, and the person can even realize it. And sometimes even the projection is followed by a moment of reflection where the person realized that they've projected their bad elements onto someone else. Projective identification does not work that way. Someone needs to detoxify the bad elements and try and restitute it to the patient in order for them to be able to grow and integrate the bad elements and grow, because they've integrated both the good and the bad. So that's pretty much it for projective identification and projection. I hope you found the video useful, and if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them down in the comment section. And I'll see you in the next one.